Today we're releasing a rare interview with Ayn Rand and Mickey Spillane, conducted by Mike Wallace. It's an extraordinary conversation that has not been broadcast since the 1960s. In less than 30 minutes, that interview will be premiered here on YouTube, and we hope you'll stay with us for the watch party. As we count down to that, we'll tell you about how that interview came about how two such different authors came to admire each other's work and become friends. We'll take you behind the scenes and sketch in some of the historical backdrop for this conversation. I'm Elan Journo, and with me today is my colleague Tom Bowden. We're delighted to be with you today. Here at the Ayn Rand Institute, we work to make people aware of Ayn Rand's ideas, encourage them to read her work, and engage with her philosophy. We're continually working to find and acquire the rights to interviews that Ayn Rand appeared in. She appeared in many over the years. And we're eager to make them easily and widely available here on YouTube. You can find many others on our YouTube channel, and I encourage you to go and explore that. Tom, let's set the scene for the conversation with Mickey Spillane and Ayn Rand. So I expect a lot of people watching or listening to us today know that Ayn Rand is the author of The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. She's the originator of the philosophy of Objectivism, and she's a big and growing cultural presence even today. Tell us a bit about Mickey Spillane. How big a deal was he? What should we know about him going in?
Well, yeah, you're in for a real treat, So this is a joint interview that Mike Wallace did with Ayn Rand and Mickey Spillane in 1961. It's very rare that Ayn Rand would ever want to be interviewed or allow herself to be interviewed with somebody else. And it's a token of how much admiration she felt for Mickey Spillane that she was willing to share the stage with him, in effect, because she was out to defend him. And the whole theme that I want you to keep in mind as you're watching this video is justice. Ayn Rand wanted to do justice to Mickey Spillane, and Mickey Spillane himself was a crusader for justice, as is the title of the video lecture that Professor Shoshana Milgram has just published on YouTube. It was given at one of our recent conferences. Professor Milgram has done a lot of research and is really the authority on this whole aspect of Ayn Rand's life. So, Mickey Spillane today in 2022, he's not that well known or that popular. But in 1961, when this interview was conducted, the preceding decade had been a decade of huge Mickey Spillane sales. So the first Mike Hammer novel, which was I, the Jury, I think I've got a copy of it here, 1947. Here's this hard-boiled private detective, Mike Hammer, who thirsts for justice and who lets nothing stop him. This book went on to become a huge bestseller, followed by 5 or 6 more Mike Hammer novels. So Spillane was selling millions and millions of copies of these books in the late 40s and early 50s. And we don't know exactly when Ayn Rand read these books, but it was probably when they came out. This was the time, if you know something about Ayn Rand's life, she was writing Atlas Shrugged. So she was not a public person really in the years from, say, mid-1940s to 1957 when she published that book. She was closeted in her study and she was working on this book. But she was reading. She read for recreation and she read for professional edification. So she read these books and she admired something. She admired the literary virtues of Mickey Spillane as portrayed in the Mike Hammer character. And again, this was a character who was a genuine hero in the sense that he was self-confident. He knew what needed to be done from a moral point of view, and he pursued that goal, trusting to his own judgment. So Mickey Spillane was this publishing phenomenon who was simultaneously disdained and hated by the critics. So if you looked in the Saturday Review of Literature, for instance, which was an authoritative source, in 1951, one of his books, the reviewer said, "Fair warning, there's a new book by Mickey Spillane. It may rank as the best Spillane, which is the faintest praise this department has ever bestowed." Okay. The New York Times described his book in the same year, described one of his books as overheated, unbelievable, disorganized, and preoccupied with violence for violence's sake. So there was this gulf, this chasm between the literati, between the opinion leaders, the reviewers, and the other authors, and Mickey Spillane. He was disdained, even as the public bought his books by the millions. The culture hated and derided him. He had nobody to defend him for this decade, this first decade of his career, until Ayn Rand came along. And that's the beauty of what you're about to see.
So we have is someone who, so in contemporary terms, it seems like a counterpart would be someone like J.K. Rowling in terms of the number of books sold, maybe not numerically identical, but a huge, well-known author, maybe like a John Grisham in the 1980s or 1990s. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing a John Grisham book on book stands in the airport and so on. So there's a phenomenon. And yet, as you were saying, that there was a disdain for him. So the intellectual authorities looked down on Spillane. So I want to just pull on that thread a little bit before we get to the actual premiere in about 20 minutes. So tell us a bit about in what context did Ayn Rand sort of initially talk about Spillane that we know? So we don't know necessarily when she actually started reading him, but we do know a little bit. And as you mentioned in Shoshana Milgram's piece that's coming, there's a new piece by her coming in our journal, New Ideal. We're really excited about that.
Yes.
But we'll come back to that in a minute. So tell us a bit about when she mentioned Spillane, in what context.
Yeah, so we know that she read him in private and developed a view of his literary virtues. It so happens that in the year 1958, just after Atlas Shrugged was published, she gave an informal seminar on fiction writing to some of her friends and associates, and used Mickey Spillane as an example of good writing. And she named his skills in plot structure and setting a scene and so forth. But in that same year, Atlas Shrugged was a bestseller, and was, as people who are watching this video probably know, is a huge bestseller and a novel written on the largest possible canvas, talking about civilization and the future of civilization and what moves the world. And this was the most dramatic, big picture, intellectual novel of ideas you can imagine. And she was nominated for the National Book Award in that year, 1958. And so here she is at a public event with like 100 reviewers and opinion leaders. And they asked her, who are your favorite writers? And she names 4 people. She names Dostoevsky, Victor Hugo, O. Henry, and Mickey Spillane. And she puts Mickey Spillane in the company of those, generally well-respected writers in a way that's sure to shock the audience. But the point being that she used that public platform, really the first one available to her, to sing Spillane's praises, and she continued. Well, we're getting ahead ourselves, but that's kind of what led up to. So Mike Wallace was interviewing her there at that National Book Award event. Fast forward 3 years, that's when the interview happens that you're going to see in a few minutes. Just a couple of months before that interview, Spillane and Ayn Rand met for the first time. They met at a lunch, which was arranged by their publisher. And they thought, well, we'll get together because we know there's some mutual admiration there. Well, it turns out Mickey Spillane had read Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand had read Mickey Spillane. And what was supposed to be a brief lunch turned out like 6 or 8 hours. And the story that you read about it is that they basically closed down this Manhattan restaurant for lunch, and all the waiters and busboys and everybody were sitting around listening to this conversation back and forth between these 2 writers. So there was definitely some sparks. They became fast friends. Their friendship didn't last forever. Ayn Rand was always very specific in her opinions about Spillane. She identified that which he had mastered and that which he was good at, but she didn't overblow him. She didn't say that he was the best writer ever or anything like that. She was very specific in what she found praiseworthy. And some of his later novels, he fell short, and she said so. So she was again, doing justice to him in public, saying when he deserved praise and withholding praise when it was not deserved.
So in the interview we're going to premiere momentarily, you can hear her explain her analysis on what she thinks is impressive in Spillane's writing and we'll get to some things to listen for. But one thing that struck me listening to it originally a few months ago was that in many cases she is articulating features of Spillane's writing in a way that he himself does not articulate. He can say things about it, but he doesn't quite have the same clarity, I would say, or sort of philosophical depth in terms of his analysis of his own work, which is interesting. And none of this is to disparage Mickey Spillane. It's interesting to get a philosopher novelist and a novelist or a writer, as he thinks of himself, and see how they look at each other's work. And just one other thing I wanted to mention. So you referred to when Ayn Rand discussed Spillane's writing style in the fiction writing course. I believe that fiction writing course is available soon, if not already, on our YouTube channel. But one thing to say is that in her book, Romantic Manifesto, which is where she lays out her theory of art and particularly looking at literature, she discusses him as an example. She mentions him in one case. She also mentioned, to your point about her being taking on this mission of justice. When she had a column in the LA Times, one of the columns was about this issue of Spillane has virtue. The intellectual authorities who are the gatekeepers on this issue, they don't recognize it. And there's something really interesting philosophically there. So she took other opportunities to raise to raise Spillane's profile and to put it in her terms, not just waving the flag and supporting him, but as you put it, I thought really aptly, she's really precise in what she identifies as his virtues, and it's not sort of overblown or oversold praise. So that's one thing to look for in when you listen to the interview coming up. I did want to say one thing before we go on to it, which is we're broadcasting it now for the first time since the 1960s, and this is publicly in effect. So that's what broadcast is, right? But I do want to mention that we did share this with a select group of our donors earlier this year as a special thank you to them. And I think the reaction they had, and that was the first time I heard this interview too, convinced us this is something, well, we can't just keep it here. We have to make sure it gets to a widest as possible audience. So, we're really grateful to our donors who make possible our ability to bring interviews like this to the public and put them on our YouTube channel. So I want to just go back to one of the threads. So we're almost halfway through our countdown. To remind people, we're going to premiere this extraordinary conversation with Mickey Spillane and Ayn Rand, hosted by Mike Wallace. Tell us a little bit about the perspective Ayn Rand had on the issue of justice, and where does it fit in her theory, her philosophical view of the world?
Yeah, that's why this interview you're going to hear is so fantastic and so it's such a treat, because it's really an example, because you can talk about justice in the abstract and giving people what they deserve, but to really do it in real life, this kind of interview is what it looks like. So as you listen, you talked about Mickey Spillane. He's not the most articulate guy in the world. I mean, he writes these best-selling books, but he's clearly not an intellectual, and he's certainly not at Ayn Rand's level in any sense. So, but the interesting thing about that is he's not really able to defend himself. But when Ayn Rand puts into words and articulates what he's doing, he's saying, yes, this really does describe what I'm doing. It does pertain to me, and it's just such a beautiful example of how the able, the smart, the intelligent can do justice to people who need it, and in this case, Mickey Spillane needed it in the cultural sense. So, of course, on a philosophical level, Atlas Shrugged was all about the virtue of justice, and she talked at length, from a philosophical point of view about what justice means. But when you listen to this interview, the surface aspect of it is what she's doing for Mickey Spillane, but the larger kind of meta aspect of it is what should have been done for Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is sitting there. She's written two of the greatest novels in world history, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And she has gotten very little praise and much disdain from the cultural class, from the literati. Um, Plus, and this is something that you'll see in Professor Milgram's article when it comes out in New Ideal, she's quoted something that was from the Ayn Rand archives, a passage that was cut from something Ayn Rand published that really describes the phenomenon of she would encounter people who loved The Fountainhead or loved Atlas Shrugged in private, and they would praise her in private, but they wouldn't stand up in public and defend her and praise her. And that was something that it was tremendously unjust and something she struggled to deal with because it was so wrong. And she struggled to really understand how people could be so wrong. And you know, the words she has to say about it, I won't try to summarize, but she talks about that. But in the background here is, and this is not something she said, it's something I'm saying, is Ayn Rand is doing for Mickey Spillane what she wishes responsible intellectuals had done for her, which was praise her. Not even necessarily to agree with everything she said or her philosophy, but to identify her literary virtues and to identify where she went right, you know, even if they didn't agree with her fully. And that just wasn't forthcoming in the 4 years since between 1957 when Atlas came out and 1961 with its interview came out, or even beyond that. She knew it wasn't coming. Now, she did her best to promote her novel, to defend herself, but it was very lonely. And the ability to do justice to Mickey Spillane was, I think, and I'm speculating here, but it was good for her. I think it must have been good for her psychologically to be able to do that and establish some part of her worldview out there in reality, that it is possible to defend the good and give words for it.
So I want to pick up on the theme you brought up, Tom, which I think is really important for people listening to the interview. And if we're interested in Ayn Rand's ideas and want to explore more, and encourage you to do that if you're new to her. So her view of justice is distinctive. So a lot of people are for justice. Who's against justice, right? I can find me somebody who's against justice, but she has a distinctive conception of what justice actually consists in. For her, it's a moral virtue. It's central to, it's a means of achieving values in the world, of finding the people that you want to be around and not being around the people that are harmful to you. But part of what's distinctive in her view is it should be objective. You should judge people, evaluate people on the basis of evidence, and doing it with as cold a logic, or sort of not cold logic, but with the same kind of rigor that you would in a courtroom judging evidence. Like, you have to really take it seriously. And the other element that's really distinctive, and not at all this exhaustive, we're here just to count down to an interview, but I couldn't resist making this point. The other element that's really distinctive, or that I want to mention here, is, and this goes to your point about Atlas Shrugged as a work where justice is a theme. It's a motivation, I think, in her mind of why she wrote the book, and part of what the book is trying to do. In her view, it's, a lot of people think of justice as, well, you got to punish the bad people in the world. You think of the courts, you think of the police, you think of, like, lock them up, right? We throw away the key. That is part of justice, no question. But in Ayn Rand's mind, a big, and maybe I think arguably this is central to what justice is about, is identifying the good, rewarding it, speaking up for it, and especially when the good is subject to injustice or sort of behavior that isn't comparable to what it deserves. In this case, I think if you think of Mickey Spillane as you were describing the story so far, he is someone who, in her mind, has literary merit. She thinks there's a lot of value in his work, as you'll hear in the interview coming up momentarily. And she also recognizes that it's the way he's being treated is unjust. And in her mind, I think this is probably what's so revealing about Ayn Rand from this interview and from the other things she's done. She's a passionate idealist. Like, for her, justice isn't this thing that you do once a year when someone offends you, or if somebody really crosses the line, it's an active principle in her thought. And she would be indignant when she sees something that's like the good being badly treated for her is as bad, if not worse, than the people who've done wrong not getting punished. And I think this is really central to the way she comes at the world, and it's powerfully illustrated in this. I'm not going to try to steal the preview anything more than that, but just listen to this interview and you'll get how she thinks about the world and why, and how the principle of justice is just so alive in her thinking. Let me hand it back to you, Tom. I know there's a lot of things we want to tell people to look for in the internet. Yeah, go ahead.
That's a perfect point. I mean, this is a half hour of Ayn Rand doing justice, and that's the way to think of it. And your point is exactly one that I forgot to make, but I want to make is most people think about justice as it's like the criminals, and you got to punish the criminals and the criminal justice system and all that. But or God's justice, you're going to strike down the sinners. Justice is about identifying the good and defending it. And you'll notice in this interview how precise Ayn Rand is. So she doesn't deal in broad generalities, where they're not justified. So Mike Wallace starts off the interview with, who do you think is the greatest living writer? And, of course, he knows that she's going to answer with Mickey Spillane. That's why the interview was set up. But she doesn't just say Mickey Spillane is the greatest ever. She says he's the greatest living writer from the aspect of, okay, so she's from these aspects: originality, imagination, color, sense of drama, plot structure. So these are things that he's good at. She doesn't say he has the best themes or the best ideas. She doesn't compare I, the Jury, to Atlas Shrugged in that sense. But she, where there is something to be praised, she praises it. And it's just very interesting to me to see this intellect. This Ayn Rand is a world-class intellect. I mean, whatever you may think of her, everybody watching this video may not adhere to objectivism or regard her with the same esteem that we do here at the Ayn Rand Institute. But she's clearly a genius and a kind of a world-class intellectual. But there's never any hint of condescension, of superiority, that she's talking down to anybody. She's talking across and up to, Mickey Spillane as a peer and as somebody she admires. And she says, when she decided to become a writer, why did she want to become a writer? Because she was bored by the folks next door, by the people around her. She wanted to live in a world where there are people she could admire and look up to. And she found that she could create these in stories that she would write. And that's why she decided to become a writer, for the sake of creating these characters, creating these stories. It's just very interesting to see her as a human being here, because again, most interviews is just her and the interviewer. But here it's her and a friend and a person that she really has a good relationship with. I'm trying to think of another interview like this, and I can't really think of one. So you see her in action, kind of what a just and objective and caring invested person, how they deal with Mickey Spillane's need for a defense.
So we've been previewing a little of what to listen for, interesting sidelights and back behind the scenes aspects of this interview coming up momentarily. I want to just ask you, Tom, for a few things people, as they listen to this now, what are some things you would suggest that they listen for? Because there's a lot here and people might end up listening to this a number of times. So I think it's useful to get a few cues just to get the most out of the experience for the first time. What would you suggest?
Well, there's two or three things. One is a great line that Mickey Spillane himself has when a critic is disdaining him for the fact that 7 of the 10 bestsellers of the 20th century were Mickey Spillane books. And you have to listen for his quip. I won't spoil it. But, he has a way of kind of putting them in their place. Some of the other things to look at, one of I think the kind of the theme of this behind the scenes broadcast is Ayn Rand on what it takes to be a hero or something like that. she does talk briefly about that and the essence of a hero, of a literary hero. And she talks about how it's a person who acts on his own judgment, who's independent, selects his goals rationally, pursues those goals, and is confident of his rightness. So look for that. Ayn Rand gets her own philosophy in naming essentially what Mike Hammer and John Galt have in common, which is a feat of integration, because there's so many differences between them. Another thing to listen for is Mike Wallace asks Ayn Rand briefly about the current literary environment, and he talks about having tried to get some other writer, current writer, to join them on the stage, and couldn't find anybody. And he asks Ayn Rand, "Well, why do you think that is?" Well, she knows exactly why, and she launches into an explanation, and she mentions writers like J.D. Salinger and Tennessee Williams, and she talks about the cultural atmosphere where the anti-hero is ascendant, where the idea that human life is futile and we don't know what we're doing, we don't have control. She talks about the idea basically that you go through life like a drunk driver. You don't know what you're doing or where you're going. And mentioning Salinger, I have to say I just recently reread The Catcher in the Rye. And if you just take Holden Caulfield and put him on a shelf, and you put Howard Rourke on one side or John Galt and Mike Hammer with Holden Caulfield, that's all you need to know about the 1950s to know the kind of gulf between the intellectuals and the people that Ayn Rand was struggling to deal with and struggling to defend both herself and Mickey Spillane.
So we're going to count down. We're almost at times. Before we wrap up, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, Tom, and if you have any closing thoughts. I just want to encourage people, after they hear the interview that we're about to rebroadcast for the first time in decades since it was originally aired, I want to encourage people to, if you're new to Ayn Rand, you've read only one thing by her, read more. Read The Fountainhead, read Atlas Shrugged, read Anthem, We the Living. All of them are well worth it. And if you've enjoyed one of her books, you're going to gain so much from reading the rest. And particularly from the context of what we're talking about here, which is I think one of the things she has in common with Spillane is taking seriously the idea of a hero in fiction that does things, that achieves things, that is pursuing deep value. So in Mike Hammer, it's not conceptualized quite this way, but he's concerned with justice as a private investigator. And in Ayn Rand's universe, there's just so many deep values. Everything is sort of structured by the perspective on life as guided by values. So read Ayn Rand, and just a couple more things to suggest for you to do to explore her view of literary works from the philosophic perspective. So read the Romantic Manifesto if you want to explore that, and you'll see how she thinks about other authors and sort of Ayn Rand as the novelist who has deep views in the philosophy of art. So definitely recommend that. And then just the other piece that we've been referring to, there is a talk by Shoshana Milgram that has been published on our YouTube channel about Mickey Spillane, so you're welcome to watch that. But there is the forthcoming article that we've been referencing, and I think both of us will say we hugely benefited from all the research that Dr. Milgram has done and informed our view of this issue. So I highly recommend that. It's coming in New Ideal soon, and we encourage you to take a look. So Tom, before we head over to the interview, any final thoughts?
You said it all. I mean, you said it all. It's I would keep in mind just the issue of justice, and when you stop listening to the interview and think back over it, think about what justice requires in your life, or what justice looks like in real life when it's practiced by a giant like Ayn Rand.
All right, thanks for joining me, Tom. It's been fun. I always love doing these countdowns with you. So we're about to roll over into the premiere. Stay with us. If you have your settings where they are by default, you'll roll into the interview automatically. Thanks for being here. We hope you'll stick around for the watch party. We'll be with you, and we'll be in the chat. And thanks to all the supporters of the Ayn Rand industry who make our work possible and who made it possible for us to share with you today this interview with Ayn Rand and Mickey Spillane. Thank you all.